John Swinney's outlined plans for the NHS this week at a speech in Edinburgh. The First Minister set out 3 priorities: to reduce immediate pressure in the NHS, to shift the balance from acute services to the community, and to use innovation to improve access to care. Andy, one of the sort of comments on this is whether this is a sort of plan that will have a real effect or whether it's actually an election pitch. And I want to use national treatment centres as an example of this. So John Swinney promised a substantial increase in capacity to significantly reduce people's waiting times, including 150,000 extra appointments and procedures in hospitals and national treatment centres in the coming year. Now, in 2016, 5 of these centres were promised within 5 years, but only 1 is currently operating, and now 10 are promised. Plans for centres in NHS Lothian, Grampian, Ayrshire and Arran were all paused last year due to a lack of funding. So when I read that, I wondered if actually that commitment feels more like an election-based ambition rather than something that is realistically going to be delivered right now.
I think everything that every leader says about the NHS is based on elections, or at least based on the electorate, because every poll will tell you that the 2 most important things to the electorate are the economy and the NHS. Yeah. They sometimes switch order a little bit, but pretty much every single poll, north and south of the border, will tell you the same thing. That's what's important to people. So politicians are compelled to talk about the NHS. But in reality, that's all it ever is. It's talk. Nothing that... I mean, I read John Swinney's speech on Monday. Nothing in it was wrong. There wasn't anything that was incorrect about his speech in terms of what the NHS needs to be and what he wants to try to make it be. But, the reality is there isn't anything in that speech that leaders before him have said, leaders of all different parties have said, health secretaries of all different parties have said. I mean, I've just heard this so many times before. It almost just... I'm just desensitised to political words on the NHS. There are realities in the NHS that we can't get away from, but that politicians simply don't want to address because the NHS has become a sort of cult-like religion in this country. The absolute reality of the NHS is that the primary concern is not money. The primary concern is system. It's a system failure. We don't organise our NHS anything like any other countries do. So other countries also have effectively nationalised demand. In other words, it's a state-funded service. But they don't have nationalised supply. In other words, it isn't always the NHS as a public sector institution that delivers the care, which is part of the problem. And ultimately, the one-word problem in our NHS is capacity. There is not the capacity. There aren't as many doctors and nurses as comparable countries. There aren't as many beds. There aren't as many hospitals. There aren't as many scanners. And that is ultimately what needs to be addressed. Because the one thing John Swinney has always said, and he's right about this, once you get into the NHS, it compares perfectly well with other services. Once you're on the operating table getting your hip replacement, you're not getting a worse hip replacement in the NHS than you are in France. Yeah. It just takes you infinitely longer to actually get there in the first place. And nothing that the Scottish Government has said for years, to be honest, has addressed that key issue. The only politician in the country who is saying unthinkable things about the NHS remains Wes Streeting, who I'm slightly concerned has gone native to a degree since he's got on the job. Nonetheless, he remains the only person who is, I think, standing up and saying, these are the realities of life, and if we don't address them, you won't have any sort of NHS, let alone the one that you actually want.
Yeah, I mean, as you guys both know, I've had reason to use the NHS quite regularly because of my son's relatively minor ailments, and I have to say that the treatment we've received has been first class throughout. And I was in for the latest checkup just to make sure he was happy with the surgeries and everything, and the doctor concerned, and he's a very, very senior doctor, lauded actually internationally, not just in Scotland, said the following phrase to me, and I thought this summed it up really well: that the front line of the NHS is a Formula One engineering team, but it's being run like it's quick fit. And his point was saying, look, the bureaucracy above us is what's hampering our ability to do things better and quicker. And I just thought that was a wonderful kind of anecdote about it. Look, I mean, I'll look more at the politics of this. I think Andy summarised some of the specifics. We know why John Swinney is doing this. In our poll, it's evidence enough. How satisfied or dissatisfied are you with the ways in which the Scottish Government has performed in the following areas? Improving the NHS, 27% satisfied, 50% dissatisfied. It's by a distance the biggest net disapproval ratings or dissatisfaction ratings that the Scottish Government has. He knows that a lot of this rise that he's witnessed is, as Alec Cole-Hamilton said earlier, more people getting fed up with the other parties as opposed to saying hooray for the SNP. He needs to demonstrate competence, and I suspect not only on this, but he'll be doing some speeches on education before long as well, because he knows he needs to strengthen his platform of a competent government before the Scottish elections. Whether the public view it as competent or not is another matter, but he's certainly trying, and I think that's the right strategy.
Yeah. At the time of recording, so we're chatting on the morning of Wednesday, the 29th of January, and later on there is going to be a vote on Neil Gray's future as Health Secretary. It's difficult to comment on that until it happens, but it's just something to be aware of, depending on when you're listening to this.
Let me make one comment on that, right?
Go for it.
In the last week, the government has junked the National Care Service, which cost an awful lot of money to investigate when everybody pretty much knew what direction it was going in. And we've had a major speech from John Swinney on NHS renewal, which if you were an opposition politician you'd be looking at saying there's nothing in that. I think as a citizen I'd probably rather the opposition focused on those two things rather than trying to get rid of yet another health secretary, which will do absolutely nothing to change the way the NHS is actually run. I'll probably say nothing more about that at this point.
Yeah. Fair. Well, it's something we might respond to next week, depending on what the outcome is. Just on the National Care Service then, the Scottish Government, as Andy says, is scrapping its plans for the National Care Service. It was one of the biggest public service reforms of the SNP's, 17 years now. The scheme was a key policy of former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon's administration. She said in 2021 she called it the most ambitious reform since devolution, and Geoff, it's gone. What does that say? What is the indication here? What does that signal?
Well, it's very disappointing for Nicola Sturgeon's legacy. I'm sure she's pretty frustrated that this decision has been taken, but I'm afraid it was inevitable. It was inevitable for some years. Now, I spoke to a very senior and respected economist known to us all. I will remain nameless. I want to protect that. But he said to me back in 2021, shortly after this was announced, and this is before any firm detail was on the table, and said, I just don't see how this could be delivered unless there is massive cuts elsewhere. And I think from that moment forth, I'd always had the view that this just can't happen as it was the plans were subsequently released. And I think, we've got to remember the limitations of devolution. My co-host always says we don't do things like normal countries. Well, over 70% of revenue and 40% of expenditure remains reserved to the United Kingdom government. We do not have much flexibility. We do have some, but much flexibility to borrow against ourselves and invest in the future. It's the nature of how devolution is funded through the block grant. And I just can't understand why it's taken so long to get to this position, which, as I say, was inevitable. Hugely disappointing. But again, I think John Swinney's made the right decision. You can't have this thing carrying on throughout 2025 when you've got an election to try and win in 2026. Take the hit just now. They're rightly getting panned for it. There's absolutely no doubt about that, but I just don't understand why it took so long for us to understand that it couldn't be delivered unless you are willing to make sweeping cuts elsewhere in your budget, which was never going to happen.
And I just want to say, just before you come in, Andy, that I know people who work in the care sector and who were trying to work out exactly how this would work, how it would function, and they, as service providers, were looking at it and going, hang on a second, this is not reality. This is not going to happen.
Yeah.
This isn't, so they've spent years considering the implications of it, of course, kind of gearing up for it, but kind of at the back of their minds going, is this going to happen or not? And that doesn't lead to good service provision either, does it? Andy, go on.
Just briefly, look, the discussion about the National Care Service is basically the same as a discussion about the National Health Service. At its root is the same issue. We have a growing, ageing population, and actually quite a sick population as well, with a reducing proportion of working age people to pay for that growing non-working population. And layered on top of that, we want our health/care services to do more and more and more, all out of general taxation, which we don't want to pay for. I mean, come on. This is square peg and round hole stuff. That ultimately, you can't have this sort of conversation without having a more realistic conversation, really, ultimately, about where the funding comes from. I mean, we discussed this a little bit if people want to look back in their feed on the podcast we did with Phoenix on demographics, but if you are a 20-year-old entering the world of work right now, the responsible advice to give to that 20-year-old is, just like you're putting some money away for your pension, put some money away for your healthcare and for your social care when you're older, because this is an impossibility that the state is going to be able to afford to pay for all of these things that we wanted to pay for. It's just not realistic.
Yeah. Is it also notable that there was agreement on the National Care Service cross-party on what needed to be done, but then there was a lack of consensus on how to actually get there? Is that something that we should... Because we're talking a lot about consensus working today. Is there a feeling actually that there is a cross-party failure on this, or is this an SNP failure to own, Geoff?
Well, actually, in the week where in the week where we found that the Scottish Government might be sued by BIFA over the DRS scheme, we all know about the controversy around gender recognition. You know, there is evidence to the argument that you're making that perhaps particularly in that period since the referendum, we haven't seen as much cross-party working as perhaps there should have been, and if there had been, would have it reduced some of these issues and perhaps better outcomes? I don't know. Politics is politics, but certainly there are a number of key issues that don't reflect well on the current Scottish Government, actually don't reflect well on the UK Government as well, incidentally, in terms of how they operate. I think Lorna Slater's got a point to make there, but ultimately, you were in charge in Scotland, the buck stops with you. So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those we'll never know, but